Dr. Merolla, you are a professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside, and specialize in the study of political behavior. In recent years, Americans seem to lack trust in the media and the information specifically they're getting about the government or politics. Do you believe this will impact some Americans' decision to vote in this upcoming election?
That's a great question. And I do want to talk a little bit about that trend. So, we have been seeing this declining trend in trust in the media over time. But one important thing to note is that it has been somewhat uneven across the partisan divide. So, Democrats have actually kind of maintained their level of trust of the media, but Republican trust of the media has declined over time. And this certainly predates Donald Trump being in office. And what we've seen since Trump has been in office, that actually Democrats have become more trusting of the media. So now we have this kind of polarization in trust in the media between the two parties. Now, of course, Republicans are trusting of some media outlets. So, for example, Fox News is an outlet that Republicans, are more likely to trust. So, to get to your question about what are the implications for, whether people will participate in elections, I think because we see this polarization, there will not be necessarily a strong relationship between trust in the media and engagement. Because even though Republicans may not trust the media generally, they do trust, say, Fox News, and so then they'll still be more inclined to participate. Prior to this period of polarization, it usually was the case that kind of people who had lower trust in the media, lower trust in political institutions would be less likely to participate. But today, because the issue itself is actually quite polarized, it may not have as much of an impact on participation trends.
Very interesting. I think that does make sense. And I think that's why in the media it's such MSNBC and CNN versus Fox. And then I know so many people, even for the debates, are watching via C-SPAN because they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to hear the commentators. They really want their own personal opinions. But I do think, I hope everyone votes if they're eligible and exercises their right. So that does make me hopeful that, even regardless of fake news or not trusting media sources or anything like that, that people still do exercise their right to vote.
Yeah, and I mean, at least the trends that we're seeing so far with early voting, we're really seeing record numbers of people even engaging in early voting this election cycle. So I suspect engagement will be quite high this cycle, in comparison even to the last presidential election.
For you. So this year we are celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Can you speak to why it is more important than ever for women to exercise their right to vote?
That's an excellent question. Thanks for bringing that up. I can also make a plug maybe for the class I'll be teaching, I think in spring quarter, on women in the American political process. And in that class, we talk about some things about the status of women in American politics and society more generally. And so, even though women have certainly made a great deal of progress in the US political system, we still, are unequally paid. And unequal pay is even greater for women of color. There was a really interesting study done on the status of women, actually by the Center for Social Innovation, that kind of outlined some of those trends. We also know, and this is especially the case in the current, climate, that women face a heavier care burden, right? Both with respect to children, watching elders, and this has been, of course, exacerbated during the pandemic. Women are, of course, underrepresented in government. Still, we've made great, there are great gains made, especially in 2018, but we still remain underrepresented in most political institutions. Women are also more likely to be victims of sexual harassment and assault. And so, even though there's been a lot of progress, there's still much more work to be done. And so, women who really care about these issues, it's really important to become involved, to vote, to show up, to engage in your communities, to try to address some of those areas where women still have, a great deal of progress to make. That would be my kind of short answer.
I know both campaigns have been targeting, may not be the correct word, but aiming for these suburban mother, worker, housewife, female population. I know there have been ads targeted towards them. Even in debates, it's brought up a lot. Can you speak to what does that mean? And I think that alone proves their vote is important if both campaigns are actively trying to earn that vote.
Yes, and women, when we look at some media coverage, right, we know that there's often this gender gap where women are more supportive of the Democratic Party compared to the Republican Party. But suburban women tend to be a little more on the fence. And part of that is that many suburban women, of course, not all, tend to be white women. And white women on average have actually voted for Republicans more than Democrats over most of US, kind of modern US history. And so they tend to be swing voters, though. And so, these are soccer moms in some elections, right? They'll be referred to suburban women, soccer moms. After 9/11, they were security moms. And so they are often, in some respects, a bellwether of how the election is going to go because, they're paying attention to the current moment, maybe not as directly connected. Some certainly are to political parties, but they maybe kind of could go either way in a given election context. And so they are often, a group that is targeted. And this has been happening for, many election cycles, even if the labels attached are different in any given cycle. It's kind of that same demographic that tends to be women living in these suburban areas, predominantly tend to be white women who may sometimes vote Republican, but then sometimes vote Democratic.
So Dr. Merolla, thank you so much for joining us. We greatly appreciate it. And I hope every woman out there who is eligible does exercise the right to vote because it's an election season, not day. So they do have until November 3rd.
No, exactly. And thanks to you both. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Mai, you are currently a PhD student in political science at the University of California, Riverside, and you work as a researcher for AAPI Data and the Center for Social Innovation. You previously also worked at Courage California, a grassroots advocacy organization based in California. You have experience in campaign communication as well as field organizing. Due to COVID-19, many traditional campaign strategies are not possible this year. Therefore, candidates are relying on virtual platforms rather than the typical massive in-person rallies, town halls, etc. It's looking different. Do you think communicating this way in campaigns is just as effective?
So it's been really hard, right? And I don't know if we can 100% replicate what we know to be as effective, right? In terms of, in person, door to door, going door to door, doing rallies and whatnot. However, just because we can't do some of this in-person stuff doesn't mean that we can't also try and communicate with people, right? And so we've decreased, or in most cases, just completely thrown out things like going door to door. But then in the place of that, we've drastically increased things like text banking, phone banking, right? Things like doing lit drops, so dropping pieces of campaign literature at people's doors and not knocking on the doors. And so there are these other things that we normally do that instead of just sort of taking them as maybe 30%, 40% of what we're doing, now it's taking up the majority of what we're doing.
Amazing. And for those who may not know, could you maybe go into more detail of what phone banking is, what text banking is, and why it's beneficial and why they're choosing to go that route?
Yeah, so basically phone banking is volunteers or sometimes paid callers who are calling voters. And text banking is the same thing, just with texting. So if you've gotten a text on your phone about the election, or a phone call asking, will you support candidate X? That's a volunteer either doing phone banking or text banking.
Wonderful. And yeah, it makes sense that there's an increase in that this year. I don't know, yourself or anyone you might know, numbers wise, right? Is there research done that this is effective? Do many people pick up their phone when they get that unknown number that they don't recognize? is there a lot of interaction, or would you say it's just good to directly reach out to the voters, even if they don't necessarily respond or pick up their phone?
So out of all of the options that we have, right? So not in addition to phone banking and text banking, thinking about yard signs or rallies and whatnot, out of all of the array of tools, text banking and phone banking and canvassing, of course, knocking on doors is the most effective way to reach voters. So even though the response rate in terms of people picking up their phone or replying to a text message is a little low, out of all the options that we have right now, they are the ones that we know to be the most effective. Direct voter contact is the most effective way to get people to vote. So even though the yard signs are fun and the rallies are fun and the waving signs on the sidewalk is great, in terms of the time that you invest into them, right, and the money that you invest into them, the text banking and phone banking are the most cost effective and time effective.
So due to the campaign reliance on social media, do you believe that we will see a higher percentage of young voters participate in this year's election?
I think a lot of people are anticipating higher voter turnout among young people. However, what we see from the early returns is that not as much as we might have thought. But that's specifically for vote by mail, right? And we know that younger people tend to go to the polls, right? Go to the vote centers or the polling location, right, closer to election day or on election day, right? And so I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the totals come into. But right now, California's ballots are starting to come in, and anyone can go onto the PDI ballot tracker and look at those returns. And right now, the 18 to 35 category is still below everyone else in terms of share of the amount of that group that are turning in their ballots early.
Thinking of the times right now, we've seen lots of violence, yet through protests, but then also resilience. Do you think these are some aspects or factors that young voters will take into account to push them to vote?
Yeah, I think young voters are or at least young people are energized right now. Now the trouble is translating that energy into casting their ballot, right? And so I know like all those campaign ads that are going out, that some of these are amazing, right? These really like powerful ads that are trying to get young people to vote. And hopefully they do show up when it comes to election day, because even though like in California, everyone's been issued a vote by mail ballot, but we still don't see, we're still at less than 30% total return, right? And with just less than 2 weeks to go. So hopefully people show up, and particularly young people, right, who maybe they have school, right, or are working, right, and they just haven't had a chance. Maybe they've even filled it out, but haven't had a chance to just take it out to the mailbox yet. And so hopefully they do.
Interesting. I also have a follow-up. With your background and experience in field organizing and campaign communications, I'd love to touch on social media a little bit more. I mean, there's Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, on YouTube. I'm seeing ads. I mean, I feel like it's everywhere. And I think that's great. And I think, again, it's just that constant reminder, especially to the younger generation, which is who they tend to be on social media often. So what's your experience with social media and using that as a form of communication with campaigns?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of, I guess, issues that I would point out. So social media is obviously great. It's very powerful, right? You can also do things like micro-targeting, right? So target very specific groups of people and very specific people. However, it also means that you have to have people who know what they're doing, right? So if you have a candidate that has a great platform, right, that has an otherwise strong campaign, right, but they're investing extra money into digital, and whoever is doing that, like that investment and spending that money, doesn't know what they're doing, right, then that money is going out the window, right? And it means that they're not actually reaching their voters. For example, so I'm from Santa Clarita, right? And sometimes people in one side of the city who are in one water district will get ads for a candidate that is actually running in a district that's just a couple streets away, right? And so things like that, right, are really, I guess, like, those are just examples of where people, I think, need to be careful, right? When we talk about social media and using social media, is that you have to be able to have people who know what they're doing with social media to get people not just out to vote, but also the information that they need to vote, right? Whether it's candidate ads or guides to propositions or whatnot. If the correct information is not getting to the correct people, then that doesn't really help in terms of getting out the vote.
Even myself for Prop 22 and Prop 23, I'll see back-to-back almost commercials, one yes and one no. And I'm like, oh my goodness, they're convincing one way or another. So I think, yes, it's a great responsibility how you go about communicating with your constituents, because you want them to get your information if you're a candidate or if you're backing one side of a proposition. But I think in this day and age, using technology to our benefit to try and, there's cons to it as well, but I think just trying to get as much information to the people as possible is really, really wonderful.
And one of the things I'll point to on those ads is that, like in California specifically, you'll see that like bottom third of the screen, right, has the disclosure, right, of who pays for those ads. And that's very recent. I was very lucky to intern for the California Clean Money campaign when we were working to get that passed. And so that's not like that in other states, right? The disclosures are not as strong or even not even there, right, as much in some other states. So we're very lucky to have laws like that.
Oh my goodness, I did not know that. Thank you. And yeah, I think it's very important to say this ad was paid by, and maybe part of your research is looking up that group or that individual who is paying for that ad. I'm, with the playoffs for baseball and sports, I've been noticing a lot of political ads during commercials for those big, they're going to get a lot of people watching. And we're going, oh my goodness, in California, I have seen very little Biden ads and I've seen very little Trump ads. I think there's just an assumption, right, of how people are going to vote. So it's almost, oh, don't spend the money there. So it's actually been very interesting watching the NLCS and the World Series to see some of those ads that we just don't have the opportunity to. So I think it's also important to realize, adding on to your point, where you live dictates what you see and what they put out. If your region is known to be red or blue, you might be seeing one side of the aisle or very little, but maybe if you're in a purple area or a swing state, they are purposely putting money into you and your area to inform you and persuade you. So I think it's very interesting how it all goes down. I think it's very impressive, your background in campaigning and organizing, and it's so important. So I just want to thank you for all the work you've done around elections, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's been very, very interesting and engaging, and I want to encourage all of our listeners, but especially those in the college age range from 18 to 27 to get out there and vote, that your vote counts. And there is a lot of pressure and assumptions, I think, for this election. So I just hope, if you're eligible, that you do voice your opinion and vote. So Mai, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I greatly, greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
So Sarah, you are currently a second-year graduate student in the Political Science department at the University of California, Riverside, with a focus in Black and electoral American politics. You previously worked as an electoral organizer for the California Democratic Party and participated in many political activities such as organizing neighborhoods, holding town halls, and policy advising. Very impressive. Can you speak to the importance of the Black vote in this election?
Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I can absolutely speak to it. I had a really fantastic time as being chair of the California Young Black Democrats, but now it's headed by Devin Murphy, who is a really, really phenomenal person. So yeah, speaking to the Black vote in this election and talking about the importance of the Black vote, what we know is that the Black vote is just as important as it is in any other election. But what we have seen though is a lot of ramped up attention surrounding Black politics, but also Black voting as well. And this is a good thing. I mean, Black voters have traditionally maintained a strong preference for the Democratic Party, and they've remained one of their highest groups to turn out. And what we've seen actually in this election, Pew Research has pointed out that 1 in 3 Black voters actually live in battleground states. When we talk about this election in particular, and we think about voting suppression efforts, I think that that has grabbed a lot of attention in the news media. This is important because while strides has been made to tackle voter suppression, they're still active in this election for more explicit measures like voter ID laws to more implicit things that are happening, such as excessively long lines when it comes to voting. We have seen that voter suppression has really been rooted in suppressing Black votes. And that's for a particular reason because when Black people do come out to vote, they essentially do end up voting with the Democratic Party. But I think just going back to again to this election, Black voting, and I think what has been highlighted in the time that we are in now is that Black mobilization and efforts of organizing, while they have been here for decades, they have absolutely played a crucial and central role in dominating what I think is us taking a critical look at our criminal justice system. So Black mobilizers have really been putting in sustained efforts to keeping that conversation going, but also too has played a crucial role in shifting public attitudes when it comes to a lot of these conversations. The fact that we have so much high visibility for the movement of Black lives, but also to their specific policy objectives is something that is very, very particular to 2020 that has really broadened out to what has made like the Black vote such a crucial element for this election.
And you were just touching upon my next question. So the Black Lives Matter movement calls for criminal justice reform, as you had mentioned, health education, and economic disparities exacerbated due to COVID-19, other pressing issues society is currently facing. What can politicians put on their agenda that would aid the Black community, in your opinion?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really great question. And I think it's important to place this into context when we talk about certain things that need to be on the agenda or certain policy initiatives we've seen highlighted out in the public. That really what we're starting to see is this crucial but central call for reform in our criminal justice systems, as you mentioned, in our health systems, education systems, and also addressing economic equity. But I think that this all kind of gets at pointing to racism and by and large gender and class that have systematically created the disparities that we see in these institutions. While Black Lives Matter has definitely acknowledged racism that happens at the individual level, that happens in between people, I think by and large what we've seen in this round is a much more poignant attention to institutions and systems and how systematic racism really, really bleeds throughout a lot of these outcomes that we measure. And so while I don't think that I can speak to all Black voters because it's important to recognize that Black voters and Black voting agenda is not a monolith, and there are a lot of diverse and complex issues within Black voting. I think at its core, there has been this kind of unified call that if we are going to be addressing systematic failure, our policies need to match that as well and be systematic policy solutions. And also to ensuring that policymakers, that elected officials are attuned into the Black voters that they actually do represent, making sure that they are being accountable to them, that these efforts and this work doesn't just stop after the election, that they are continued and sustained and really go beyond just party politics. Just like and I only say this because I think it's important because there is like a narrative that like the movement for Black Lives or this Black Lives Matter movement was very organic and that it like naturally kind of arose from this situation. But I think it's also important to tell the other side of the story is that the movement for Black Lives has been a movement that has been organizing for years on end, since 2012, 2013. And that is just like the present of the movement for Black Lives. There's other social movements that came before then. But yeah, I think it's important to get at that this work is critical, but it's also strategic as well, is that that this idea that we can, I lost my train of thought. But really just kind of wanting to highlight that while this opportunity itself, that we could not have predicted George Floyd's murder at all, what there needs to be that underlining a lot of this has been efforts that are not surprising at all when we begin to look at like a lot of the outcomes, and what we're just seeing is just a lot of public facing attention to it.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. And I love, I think 2020 has been a very difficult year for, I can't even name all the reasons, but I'm very, very happy to see these social movements arising and for people to dig in deep and voice their opinions and to physically take it to the streets and protest if that's what they choose to do, or utilize social media, have those difficult conversations with family members. I think it's a lot about morals and not politics, right? It shouldn't be a political issue. Human rights shouldn't be a political issue. So thank you for just talking more to that.
Yeah. Oh, you actually jogged my memory. It's really quick, just a portion. It's that protest politics has always been the center of pushing the narrative for a lot of these policy solutions to even make it to more of a conventional or normative a way of us looking at certain things like defund the police or universal basic income. It really comes from protesters and mobilizers really opening up that space and really imagining a lot of these things becoming actually living, breathing like policy actions.
So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. We had an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and just thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, you all having me for this session. It was great.